The next class of submarines started by the Japanese was the three boats of the 5,223 surfaced and 6,560 submerged ton I-400 class, also known as the Sen-Toku type, which were started in January 1943. The concept of these guys lay in the early war and the Japanese desire to demoralize the U.S. into a negotiated peace by bringing the war to the U.S. Since it's hard for submarines to attack inland, and given the somewhat success of the I-boats float planes early in the war, the plan was to build submarines that could carry three actually, attack float planes. I hesitate to say submarine aircraft carriers because they only carried 3 planes. These submarines would operate together and launch airstrikes on the continental U.S. I want to be clear, invasion was never on the table, only raids. Amazingly, they didn't just want to attack the West Coast, but also the East Coast. This meant they would have to have enough range to sail from Japan non-stop to the U.S. East Coast and back while carrying a useful number of aircraft. This explains their gigantic size and range. The project was personally sponsored by Admiral Yamamoto, but once he died, support for it waned, so work was a start-stop affair. As with other contemporary Japanese submarines that carried aircraft, the hangar was forward of the sail with a catapult in front of it. Even with their giant size, the 3 aircraft had to be stored partially disassembled, so launching and recovering was never going to be fast. But they just accepted that. Another thing that was quietly accepted was that given that the U.S. was now on a war footing, while they could recover the aircraft, the chances of any plane making it back were slim. Like the midget subs, it wasn't a suicide mission per se, but yeah. For various reasons, the hangar wasn't exactly on the center line, but slightly offset to starboard. This played havoc with hydrodynamic flow, and the helmsman had to constantly keep the rudder turned over center to compensate. Inside the main hull, they were also unique. Carrying so much weight topside meant they were inherently unstable on the surface. And remember, submarines of this era spent most of their time on the surface. As usual, the only way to fix this was to make them wider. They could have made the pressure hull oval-shaped, but then they get into the free flood effect and possible survivability issues if damaged. As such, the course chosen was to put 2 pressure hulls side by side inside the outer hull with the conning tower straddling them. Some have suggested this inspired the later Soviet Typhoon class, and while I have little doubt the Soviets looked at a 40-year-old design and saw it as cutting edge, I'm skeptical. Either way, even with its massive size, having 2 pressure hulls meant each was relatively cramped. Enjoy your world cruise. Without Yamamoto's guiding hand, and with the war deteriorating, the mission was changed over and over. At first it was to attack the U.S. mainland. When that became unreasonable, it was shifted to attacking the Panama Canal. When that became unfeasible, it became to again attack Hawaii. When that looked undoable, it became to attack the U.S. fleet base in the Marshalls. When the U.S. fleet anchorage moved to Ulithi later in the war, the plan shifted to attack there, and they weren't even finished yet. Once the Philippines were partially liberated in late 1944, Japan's entire reason for going to war with the U.S. was unraveled: to capture the Philippines to prevent them from being used to interdict the supply lines between what's now Indonesia and Japan. As a result, the third boat was completed as a tanker submarine. See, that actually makes sense to me. Sort of. Not that it mattered, as by the time she was finished, the war was wrapping up. Post-war, they were studied by the Americans and essentially considered impressive, but not practical. Again, there was no real innovation here. just an attempt to brute force it. I-400 was started January 18, 1943 and completed December 30th, 1944. I-401 was started April 26, 1943 and completed January 8, 1945. I-402 was started October 20th, 1943 and completed July 24th, 1945. I-403 was canceled before even being started. I-404 was started November 8th, 1943, but was canceled June 4th, 1945, when 95% complete. I-405 was started September 27th, 1943, but was quickly canceled. Main armament was 8 bow 533mm tubes for 20 torpedoes. A single open 140mm deck gun was mounted aft of the sail. Propulsion on the surface was provided by 4 diesel engines, which produced 7,700 horsepower that ran the 2 propellers and recharged the batteries for a surface speed of 18 knots. While submerged, they used their batteries to power 4 motors, which produced 2,400 horsepower for a top speed of 6 knots. Range on the surface was 30,000 nautical miles at 16 knots, and submerged they could do 60 nautical miles at 3 knots. Test diving depth was 100 meters. The hangar was built into the forward part of the sail and could hold 3 float planes with a catapult in front of it. In May 1945, I-400 and 401 were fitted with snorkels. I-402 was completed as a tanker submarine. I-400 and I-401 were in port on March 19, 1945, when Task Force 58's aircraft raided the harbor, though they weren't really damaged. In mid-April, they made a supply run from Japan to Manchuria, but while outbound, I-401 hit a mine and had to return for repairs, leaving I-400 to make the run. Finally, in mid-July, they set out on their first real combat mission to launch an air raid on Ulithi Harbor. It is notable here, in a very dishonorable act, their aircraft were painted with fake American symbols to hide their true origins. It didn't matter, though, because even before they reached the launch position, the war ended and they had to raise the black flag of surrender and head back home, dumping their mismarked aircraft along the way. Post-war, they were studied by the Americans, who essentially considered them eccentric curiosities, but ultimately impractical and technologically stagnant. So once everyone got their laughs, they were scuttled off Hawaii, and everyone took off to study the Type 21s. I-402 was in port at Kure on August 11, 1945, when an air raid damaged her. A few days later, the war was over. Post-war, she was scuttled off Goto Island. I-404 and I-405 were canceled while under construction, and their incomplete hulks were eventually scrapped.